peace and liberty. But why are we here today and why are we on this spot? Because we're right across from Tammy Baldwin's office. And she has had a tremendous effect and voted a certain way on peace issues. And we're going to review those today. And we're going to review my positions. And we're going to talk about why peace and war, why the war machine is the ultimate corruption. I don't know if you guys remember history at all back in the 1960s, but on October 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy signed an executive order to bring all the troops home from Vietnam. He had found out that 73 people had died there. There were only maybe 1,500 troops there at the time. And that was too many for him. Too many Americans died in Vietnam even that early. Exactly 1 month later in Dallas, he was shot, killed. Fast forward to 1967. Martin Luther King Jr., after campaigning mostly for civil rights for his entire career, started to talk about the war in Vietnam. At that point, he was no longer welcome at the Johnson White House. He was excluded. And about a year after that, after giving his famous sermon in New York, he was shot to death. In 1968, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was campaigning for president on ending the war in Vietnam. He was shot to death at a hotel in Los Angeles. The ultimate corruption is that our nation, with our tax dollars, our blood, sweat, tears, our children, our friends, our neighbors, are being sent off to war and made to pay for war, all based on lies. The lies started after World War II, telling lies about Vietnam being a domino effect for Chinese aggression. They continued on through all the various wars we've been through, especially the war in Iraq in 2001, starting in 2002, based on lies, based on weapons of mass destruction that were never there. And every war since then has been based on lies. So what can we do about it? Both parties that control our government right now are for war. Neither party, Republican nor Democrat, virtually no representatives in Congress are for peace, are willing to stand up against war. It takes independent candidates, libertarians, Greens, etc., to stand up for war, to stand up for peace, and to fight against war. But what happens is, because the war machine is so powerful and spends so much money on politicians and political parties, that it's virtually impossible to be heard in that environment, to get on the ballot, to have candidates in the Republican or Democratic Party or members of Congress actually stand up for peace. Because if they do, they're primaried out and they don't get funded. So how does Tammy Baldwin fit into this? And for that matter, Eric Hovde. Eric Hovde has no record on war and peace. Basically just showed up here from California. He does have a house here. His family is from here. But this man is running for U.S. Senate again with no record of activism, no record of taking positions on things. Basically what Republicans have done is just he showed up and he was made the nominee because he's spending $20 million on his own campaign. And they decide that the values that they would like to see in a candidate belong to him, regardless of the fact that he doesn't say anything about them, nor has he been active in politics except for to come back to Wisconsin and run for office. But as I mentioned in the beginning, the reason that we're here on this spot is because we're across from Tammy Baldwin. I know this can be difficult for a democratically dominant Dane County to hear, but Tammy Baldwin, while in terms of progressive issues has been good on certain things, she has been terrible on the issues of war and peace. She has never voted or resisted any increase or any full funding of the Pentagon and all of the military institutions and the surveillance state. She has never said a word about a ceasefire in Ukraine. And as a matter of fact, a year and a half ago, I and other peace activists were on a phone call with her and her staff in Washington and asked if they would call for a ceasefire in Ukraine. At that time, we knew that that war was not winnable. Despite Putin's aggression, we knew the war wasn't winnable, not only for Ukraine, but not even with the United States backing. And that's still true today, while still people are dying. She said that she would not talk about a ceasefire for strategic reasons, meaning she wanted the war to continue. She wanted Ukrainians to continue dying, Russians to continue dying, our tax dollars to go over there. She wanted the war machine to continue its carnage. She also hasn't stood up for the situation in the Middle East. Way too late, some Democrats have stood up and said there should be a ceasefire there, but she will not mention the fact that tens of thousands of Palestinians have died and that there's a genocide going on. She has never mentioned anything like that. And why? So ask yourself why. If Tammy Baldwin is such a progressive, if she's for civil liberties, if she's a loving, kind, joyful person, like what the Democratic Party has been touting and standing for supposedly, then why would she do that? And the simple reason is this, and it applies to her and every other member of Congress pretty much. And that is they don't do the bidding of their citizens. They don't do the bidding of their constituents. They do what they're told by their donors and by the big parties. The tens of millions of dollars that flow into the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee require that Democrat and Republican members of Congress vote accordingly, that they continue to vote for war, that they continue to vote the Pentagon a full budget, they continue to not even audit the Pentagon, and those audits that have taken place, the Pentagon has failed. They don't care that the Pentagon is using money or losing money, wasting money, they don't care. All they care about is staying in office, and how they stay in office, how Tammy Baldwin has stayed in office, and so many other members of Congress have stayed in office is by obeying their masters. And their masters are not the voter, not the constituent, not the people of Wisconsin, but the people that fund their campaigns and fund their big parties. And that has been true in spades for Tammy Baldwin. But let's talk about one more aspect of this. I believe if we knew the truth, if we can continue to know the truth about what our government is doing with our tax dollars and with our fellow citizens, with our friends and neighbors and children, if we knew, I believe most of us would resist that. Most of us would vote against that. Most of us wouldn't put up with that. However, there's also been a constant war of corruption against us hearing about what our government is doing. And nothing embodies that situation better than the situation that Julian Assange was in. If you're not familiar, Julian Assange, Australian citizen, founder of WikiLeaks, which was basically a portal, is still basically a portal for whistleblowers to publish their information once verified. Julian Assange was put in prison in 2019 in London after attempts on his life by our CIA on foreign soil. This is all documented. And after he'd been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. As a matter of fact, the CIA in 2019 engineered a change in government in Ecuador for the sole purpose of Ecuador not allowing him to be welcome in their office in London anymore. So we were after him the whole time. And why? Even the Obama administration admitted that the things that he released were true. All of those things you heard about Abu Ghraib in Iraq and the other atrocities that happened in the late 2000s, all true, all verified by the government, and yet still the CIA and the American government under Trump, under Biden, etc., persecuted him. The simple reason is that they don't want us to know what they're doing. Our government that we all should vote for, that we vote for, Democrats, Republicans, the taxes that we pay go to, number one, warfare, number two, us not finding out about that warfare and all the things that they do. And Tammy Baldwin, nor Eric Hovde, obviously, he hasn't been in office, but Tammy Baldwin in particular has done nothing about it. Absolutely nothing. I've never heard her, nor anyone has ever heard her say the name Julian Assange out loud. Now, he's free, but he had to plead guilty to a small crime in order to do so. And he's safe in Australia now. But he should be pardoned. And Ed Snowden should be pardoned. And Ross Ulbricht should be pardoned. Because all they are guilty of is trying to let all of us know what our government is doing. Just let us know what they're doing. And they're continuing to try to hide it from us. We should not stand for this. This is the ultimate corruption. When they take your money and they take people out of our communities to fight for things that aren't true, that aren't real, that are based on lies, and then cover it up to the point where they'll kill people to cover it up. This is the truth of the American government. It's not what we think it is. There isn't representative government working right now. All that happens is we vote in this sort of charade of an election for people that tell us what they're going to do or what they've done, both of which are usually lies. We send them to Washington for them to obey their masters, the real masters, which in this case is Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera, who funnel tons of money into the big political parties. And it doesn't matter Republican versus Democrat. Both parties do the same thing. Both parties operate the same way. You think you're going to vote or have voted for this election on November 5th for candidates that stand for something, or that there's differences, vast differences between Republicans and Democrats. But in fact, they're just sponsored by the same well-funded lobbies in order to keep the warfare state going and in order to continue to hide it. So I ask you to reconsider how you think about your government and actually look at what they do and what they don't do. Not only get caught up in the campaign season and figuring out who you should vote for, who stands for what, but hold them accountable. Look at their record, see what they're doing, see what they're not doing. Make sure you know what they're talking about now and hold them accountable for it a few months or a couple of years from now, so that they can't get away with lying to you every 2, 4, or 6 years. And they're not lying just to stay in office. They're lying because they're paid to, and they've agreed to be paid to lie. So Tammy Baldwin, fuck you. Eric Hubby, fuck you. Pardon my French. I'm sorry. Agreed. Sorry. I'm very passionate about this, but I apologize. That was out of line. But that's how I feel about it. I imagine anyone who pays attention to this issue should feel the same way. I'm going to allow some other people to speak here. First of all, my friend and fellow activist Miles Kristen would like to speak on this subject too.
I highly recommend you take a look on State Street and notice how many people on State Street, how many homeless people there are living on State Street. Meanwhile, we have hundreds of billions of dollars to spend on things like the war in Ukraine, or funding Israel, or other conflicts all around the world. In 2002, we had a vote to invade Iraq. It was based on lies. The lie that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which caused an immediate threat to the American people. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lied to us. People like Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton voted for that war and continued that war for over a decade. To this day, we actually still have troops in Iraq and an unknown amount of mercenaries. And now today we have this conflict in Ukraine. We're not getting Zelensky and Putin to sit down and negotiate a peace deal. We're ignoring peace deals and peace negotiations from years past. This war in Ukraine is escalating. There's talk of giving Ukraine long-range missiles. In fact, we've already given Ukraine missiles that they are shooting into Russia. This is a very serious matter. On one hand, you have President Trump, who will follow Netanyahu in Israel into doing anything. And on the other hand, you've got Kamala Harris, who will continue the war in Ukraine and potentially escalate it even further. As we speak, we literally have Russian ships off the coast of Alaska and Florida, and nobody's talking about it. It's like we're living through the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, but nobody's talking about it. The situation with Russia is incredibly serious, and we need peace. We need to negotiate peace deals. There needs to be serious talk. But the problem is the lobbyists, the military-industrial complex, they control both sides of the aisle. Even our most progressive people like Bernie Sanders or Tammy Baldwin will spend hundreds of millions and billions of dollars on things like the F-35. This is a very serious issue. And I know a lot of people out there are very passionate about who they're going to vote for in a few days. But you got to be serious about the fact that both of the major party candidates are pro-war. They are willing to get us in giant military conflicts. We have to really think about what's going on, and we have to be very serious about taking care of our veterans. How many thousands, tens of thousands of homeless veterans do we have in this country? It's despicable that we send people to go fight and not take care of them when they get back. These wars are based on lies. The money should be spent here at home. Like I said, just look at State Street and see how many homeless people we have living off the street. Well, we have hundreds of billions and even essentially trillions of dollars that we have spent on war. That's pretty much all I have.
Thanks, Miles. That was Miles Kristen. Next speaker, a friend of mine, a leader in the Libertarian Party of Dane County, former Democrat, I believe, Austin Bond. Appreciate it, Bill.
I'm running for president of the Libertarian Party of Dane County. I was 11 years old on September 11, 2001. I was getting ready to go to school. My father came in the kitchen saying, "A plane just hit the Twin Towers." I joined him in the living room to watch the news as the second plane came out of the right side of the screen and slammed into the second tower. About 10 months prior, my parents had let me stay up and watch the election results of 2000 come in. As staunch Democrats, my family couldn't believe the end result. You can imagine how this series of events affected me, a foundational experience that set me on a path that will lead me before you today. 23 years ago, then Representative Tammy Baldwin voted against the Patriot Act. In 2004, Representative Baldwin voted against authorizing military deployment to Iraq. I applaud Tammy Baldwin for those votes. However, in 2011, Baldwin voted against banning American armed forces from deployment in Libya, setting up the September 11, 2012 Benghazi attack, killing 4 Americans. Fast forward to today, Senator Baldwin has voted to keep the war machine turning, authorizing hundreds of billions in funding for 2 wars. The first, taking Vladimir Putin's bait in Ukraine, a desperate attempt to draw us into another expensive quagmire at the expense of his own citizens, drawing us closer and closer to a debt and currency crisis. The second, Benjamin Netanyahu's reactionary crusade to exterminate the Palestinian nation, again at the expense of his own people, triggering a rise in rank anti-Semitism. Benjamin Netanyahu is a traitor to the memory of those who perished in and survived the Holocaust. I'm sick of paying for him. All of this reckless war spending only feeds the inflationary beast that relentlessly robs my generation of economic opportunity and dignity. The hopeless outlook for our future is palatable. Our dollar is debased, banks insolvent, property ownership out of reach, all in the name of a military industrial complex that doesn't care about you. Despite these headwinds, we still have a choice. If we can set aside our differences, there is hope. A vote for Phil Anderson and Chase Oliver is a vote for ending the corrupt imperial meat grinder and a step towards preserving our democratic republic and our lost tradition of civil debate. I want to be clear, I'm a pretty liberal guy, and I'm guessing there are a few key areas where Phil and I disagree deeply, namely on the issue of abortion. This has been one of the largest wedge issues of the last 50 years, and it certainly has not been resolved. But over a glass of fine Islay Scotch whiskey, we were able to discuss this topic without levying unreasonable attacks and at least listening to the other's stance. The ability for us, American citizens, to reach past our preconceptions and tune out the noise is paramount in putting an end to our ever-growing political divide and restoring civil discourse. In order to truly disrupt the corruption, we need to make peace at home before we make peace abroad. Donald Trump and the GOP can't make America great again. And Kamala Harris and the Democrats can't save democracy. It's up to us. It's up to each and every one of us to make sure that we aren't drinking too much of whatever flavor of Kool-Aid we prefer. To make sure that we can keep an open mind Then and only then can we disrupt the divisive rhetoric and bring the political temperature down. As I mentioned earlier, I'm running for the president of the Libertarian Party of Dane County. And my goal is to form a broad coalition of members dedicated to making peace at home before peace abroad, right here in our own backyards. Join me on my mission today. Join LP Dane and vote for Phil Anderson for Senate.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Austin. I'm going to wrap this up for now. But first of all, I'd like to apologize for cursing earlier. I really care about this issue. It gets me fired up as a veteran in particular. I served in what's used to be called West Germany, 1985 to 1988. Many have served before and many since. The veterans of the Iraq wars and Afghanistan have stories to tell that aren't being told. Stories of corruption, stories of lies, and you wonder why so many of them come home, not just physically injured, or they don't come home, but mentally scarred with mental health issues. Because so many, including some people that are dear to me, went over there to fight, signed up after 9/11, signed up later, and all they wanted to do was serve their country. They believed that we were under attack, that there was a threat, that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They believed everything the government told them, and they went over there and found out that it wasn't true. And they were offering their lives, and not just their lives, but their time with their families and their kids, time away from their jobs, time in a foreign land that they were unfamiliar with, time spent risking their life, not knowing on any particular day if they would live to the end of it. They did all that, and they found out it was a lie, an absolute lie. And the same for veterans of Vietnam and other conflicts as well. They come back and they come back ill because they've been forced basically at the barrel of a gun to live a lie. And I don't know how any of you who are listening right now, I don't know. I'm not criticizing necessarily, but I don't know how anyone who's listening to what I'm saying or anyone who's paid attention to the facts of the wars that we've been involved in can vote for Democrats or Republicans anymore, most of them anyway. Because the Democrats and Republicans, including Tammy Baldwin and Eric Cubby, is lined up to take the same position, have consistently voted for war, have consistently voted for lies, have consistently voted for hiding the truth every single time, without exception. And those of you walking by, you're from Madison, you're from Dane County, you're from around Wisconsin, wherever you're from. I urge you, at least, if you wouldn't consider voting for me, which I understand, I'm a libertarian, that's not everyone's cup of tea. But at the very least, look into other candidates and look into the record of the person, not just what they say or the rhetoric of what they're talking about. Don't just vote on them for the things that they do talk about, but vote on them for the things that they promised to do and failed to do, or didn't talk about, then did. The things that they told the truth about, the things that they lied about, the things that the people they take money from, and how they vote. I'm going to tell you a brief story about how your government works. This is from a New Yorker magazine article. It's now almost 10 years old, but it's been verified to be true by various congressmen who in private moments will tell the truth about this. The House of Representatives has 435 people. On any given day to pass legislation, there's supposed to be 218 votes. That's a quorum, according to Robert's Rules of Order and the House of Representatives. But what actually happens is, if there's nothing interesting going on in the House, then there's just not that many members there, 50, 80, 100. And the members of Congress can sit in their offices and watch by, it used to be closed circuit television, I don't know if it's still the same. They can see what's going on in the House, and if they want to go vote on something, they can, but if they don't have to. But what happens during these sessions is that legislation gets passed that benefits the donors to both parties. None of the votes that take place on these days are roll call votes. They're all by acclamation. And it's all because the things that they're voting on are tax loopholes, giveaways, handouts, earmarks, whatever, for those donors that give money to both big parties. So they don't need the whole House there. Thomas Massey, who is a Republican House of Representatives member from Kentucky, regularly goes over there and requests a roll call vote. And what that does is it means that they have to take a roll call, which would reveal not only is there not a quorum there, But then all of those representatives' votes would have to be on record. And they don't want that because they're voting for stuff they said they never would vote for. So he foils that. So they withdraw the bill and it gets voted on later. That's how your government works. You can talk to anybody. You can ask Tammy Baldwin, or you can ask Mark Pocan, our member of Congress currently now, and they'll tell you the truth if they tell you the truth. And they will say that they are regularly forced to vote on legislation that they haven't read. They haven't read it. And as we all know, too, a lot of this legislation isn't even named for what's in it. I'll give you an example. The Inflation Reduction Act had so much government spending in it. And government spending is what causes inflation. It's what causes an increase in the money supply. That act is called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it specifically and purposely creates inflation. And members of Congress had to vote on it before they even read it. They had to vote on Obamacare before they read it. The Infrastructure Act before they read it. They're not reading it. They're not listening to you. They're not getting feedback. They're not representing you. Your people in Washington do not represent you. There's no factual dissent to that idea. They're just not. They just don't. And not by choice or necessarily because they're corrupt, but they belong to a system. They participated in a assent in a system that is run from the top down. And that is the donors write the bills. The bills are handed to the Republican National Committee and Democratic National Committee. They make sure those bills pass with minimal revision, with minimal dissent. And even now, and this was enacted in 2016 by then Speaker Paul Ryan, you can't even amend a bill on the floor of the House anymore that has spending to do with it. So even if your congressperson were honest and legit, which they're not, but even if they were, they couldn't change anything on the floor of the House. That's a rather long story to tell at a rally when people are walking by. However, it just demonstrates, one among many, that the people that are supposed to be representing us in Congress do not and will not because they're paid not to. And the things that they do, they will hide from us purposefully, even to the point of killing people to avoid being outing the government for what it does. So we're going to wrap that up here today, unless somebody else wants to speak briefly. Nope, I'm getting a head shake from my compadres. So again, in closing, please consider voting for me. Please consider voting for other third-party and independent candidates. At the very least, if you care about the health and welfare of this country, and the health and welfare of the people that you love and that you live with in your communities, and you don't want them to be lied to anymore or sent off to war over lies anymore, then look hard at what your representatives do and don't do, because that will tell the story, and you'll know that what they're doing is corrupt and murderous. Peace is the issue of our time. It should be the issue of any time. And if you don't hold your votes hostage, meaning that if you support a Republican or Democratic candidate and you don't like what they're doing, but then as pressure comes around during the election season, you vote for them anyway, then you're part of the problem, because nothing will ever change. Why would Tammy Baldwin stand up for peace when peace voters still vote for her? Why will Eric Hovde do the same thing if he gets elected? They just won't. The only way that you can fight this is by truly telling them you're not voting for them, and then don't vote for them. And that doesn't necessarily mean vote for me. There's a Green Party candidate on the ballot in Congressional District 1 and for president in Wisconsin. I don't care who else you vote for, because peace is really important to me, to the point where I used the F word earlier. I apologize for that. But if you care, but you still vote for them, they're not going to change. And that's just a fact that's been borne out for 70 years. One more speaker, my dear friend and fellow activist, Terry Lyon.
Thank you, Phil. As Phil said, my name is Terry Lyon. I ran for office in 2020, much with the same mindset that Phil has, to try to put an end in the two-party or uniparty corruption that we have in this state and also in this country. We hear a lot of people complain about Republicans. We hear a lot of people complain about Democrats. The popularity of both parties is 87% or disapproval, but yet they continue to get voted in. And why is that? Because the way the system is manipulated, that those who generate the most money for the party generally gets the advancement and then Coke and Pepsi run against each other, and one party wins, and it's the same system that owns it. Now, as we talked about here about the corruption, think about this. How many times have we heard a politician, will use the federal government, they get voted in, they have a salary of $178,000 a year. 5 years later, 6 years later, they're worth multiple millions of dollars. And yet we struggle with prices going up, and yet they're worth more and more and more the many years that they're in office. And then as Phil has talked, and other speakers here have talked as well, where they will vote for their masters, the military industrial complex, where in this country, we will have politicians stand and prey on the patriotic hearts of men and women to send them to foreign countries to fight their wars. And then when they are physically, mentally damaged, they will come back. And then we get to watch commercials with Mark Wahlberg and other musicians, Hollywood actors saying that we should donate the price of a cup of coffee a day to take care of these men and women, when the United States military budget is more than the next 7 countries underneath us combined. And our government can't take 5% of that to take care of the men and women that they have preyed on, to send overseas, to lose arms, to lose legs, to be burned severely, time away from their family. If you look at the divorce rate of those in the military, it's higher than that of non-military marriages. And what does the government do? See you later. Yeah, we'll give you a couple little benefits here with the VA, but you're going to have to jump through this hoop, jump through this hoop, jump through this hoop, because that's how much we care about you after you come back and put your body and your mind on the line for the military industrial complex benefit. That is the country that we live in. And I know it's hard for people to accept that, because we live in the United States. The United States is the greatest country there is. There's no question about that. But our politicians are corrupt. Our politicians don't care about the people. The only ones that they care about are the ones that fund their campaigns and write the big checks. And they bow down to those masters to continue to keep that funding in. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
That was awesome. I keep threatening to wrap up, but I think we will now with just my final comments. I'm going to repeat because people are walking around the square and they haven't heard the whole message, but I'm going to boil it down to this. Your government lies to you. They cover things up. They send us to war over lies. It's all a big scam to keep you fooled, to keep us contributing money to that. And it can keep electing politicians to office who will cooperate with that. So again, I encourage you to look at third-party candidates, look at independent candidates, consider voting for somebody else other than Democrats and Republicans who continually lie to us and take us to war. There's lots of options available. I'm one of them for United States Senate. You'll see me on your ballot if you haven't already as under disrupt the corruption. Please consider voting for me, but also for president, for Congress, for whatever other offices you're voting for. Please consider voting for people that are willing to look at the hard facts about what the government actually does and do something about it, and not brush over it with lies, rhetoric, expensive ad campaigns, and so that they can fool you into believing that you're voting for something that you're actually not. Thank you very much for listening. Again, I apologize for swearing earlier. I'm very passionate about the issue of peace. But please consider, if you haven't voted already, voting for me on November 5th, or voting for, at least considering third-party or independent candidates. Thank you.
I'm down here almost a week. I hardly see anyone saying chemtrails, 9/11. Oh, it's the same.